Following John C. Fremont's second expedition, both he and his guide, Kit Carson, would become instant celebrities. Folks started calling Fremont the Pathfinder, newspapers scrambled to publish his reports, and the U.S. Congress authorized an astounding $50,000 for a third expedition. Hell, there were even some encouraging the young explorer to run for president. As for Carson, he too would become a household name. Although Fremont wrote glowingly of most of his scouts, it was Carson who caught the public's attention. The stories of his heroism and wilderness skills just flat out excited the nation's collective imagination. In no time flat, dime novels were published portraying the just 5.5-foot tall Carson as a giant of a man who rescued maidens, avenged all manner of wrongs, and slaughtered hostiles by the thousands. As one biographer so astutely put it, seemingly overnight, Kit Carson was transformed into a real-life 19th century action hero. And again, Carson had already garnered himself a pretty decent reputation out west. After running away from home at the age of 16, Kit became a fur trapper, and for well over a decade, he explored the West extensively, harvesting beaver and pretty much perfecting the art of living off the land. It wasn't until the fur trade petered out that Carson had a chance encounter with the aforementioned John C. Fremont, then a young lieutenant with the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. Fremont had recently been charged with mapping out the Oregon Trail, and as fate would have it, he hired Carson as his guide. And as I alluded to a moment ago, this partnership proved extremely successful. Indeed, Fremont's published reports spurred on a great migration as pioneers began flocking west to the Promised Land in droves. But then there was the third expedition, one we're going to discuss today that only had the pretense of being topographical. Officially, Fremont was to explore the eastern slope of the Rockies in present-day Colorado. But in all reality, he and his men, with Kit Carson once more serving as guide, would head straight to California. And in doing so, they'd ignite a revolution. Now, at this point in time, California was still owned by Mexico, at least on paper. And to say that things were getting a mite tense is a bit of an understatement. Even the native-born Hispanic Californios weren't all that happy with the Mexican government. Not only did they feel neglected by the powers that be, but they had even began having discussions as to whether or not they'd be better off forming their own republic, or even allowing themselves to be annexed by another country like Great Britain. By 1845, things had gotten so bad that the Californios had forcefully ejected the Mexican governor and installed one of their own, a guy by the name of Pio Pico. There was still infighting among the Hispanics, though, and even Governor Pico supported their efforts to break away from Mexico and become a British protectorate. And then, of course, you had California's ever-growing population of American immigrants, who, as it turns out, were also calling for annexation, only to the United States as opposed to Great Britain. Many of these settlers were there illegally, having failed to become naturalized citizens. And much like the Californios, they didn't care all that much for the Mexican authorities. Fremont and Carson first encountered these American settlers living in the Sacramento Valley during their second expedition. And by the time they showed up again in the fall of 1845, things had taken a drastic turn for the worse. Mexican General Jose Castro had ordered all illegals, aka the Americans, to leave the territory. And if that ain't bad enough, rumors began to circulate that he had bribed the local indigenous to attack the American settlers. As such, the settlers turned to Fremont and Carson for help. It was at their urgings that Fremont's men massacred a large village of natives on the Sacramento River, not far from the present-day town of Redding. This was followed by Carson guiding Fremont's party north into Oregon, where they had yet another bloody engagement with the natives, this time the Klamath. It was also there in Oregon where Fremont was joined by Marine Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie, bearing secret dispatches from Washington, D.C. To this day, nobody knows exactly what Gillespie's dispatches contained, but whatever it was enough for Fremont to again order his men south into California. It was at this time that Fremont dropped all exploratory pretenses and make it known that he was planning on taking the entirety of California for the Americans. So long story short, nobody in California was really seeing eye to eye back in 1845. The Hispanic Californios didn't have much trust in either the American settlers or their own government down in Mexico. And the Americans, in addition to having a strong belief in manifest destiny and thinking that they had a God-given right to California, also felt like they were being unjustly targeted by the Hispanics. As for the indigenous, they were just caught in the middle and basically getting screwed by everybody. What else is new? Of course, it didn't help matters none that the U.S. government would soon throw gas on this tinderbox by declaring war on Mexico. And in the midst of all this social and political turmoil came the Pathfinder. At his helm, a small company of Mountain Men and Delaware scouts, headed up by none other than the famed frontiersman Kit Carson. Needless to say, things were about to get real interesting and real bloody there in California. Join me today as we discuss all of this and more, including the Bear Flag Revolt, Kit Carson's trip to the Capitol, and his unenthusiastic involvement in the Mexican-American War. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Ah, yes, old John C. Fremont. It's been brought to my attention by many listeners that I have been pronouncing the name Fremont incorrectly. Despite numerous schools, towns, counties, parks, hospitals, and even a damn naval vessel being named after the man, I somehow stupidly and very idiotically messed it up. Shame on me. I have attempted to make atonement by flogging myself vigorously over the course of the last 24 hours, and despite my backside now resembling raw hamburger meat, I still don't think I've really learned my lesson. So rest assured, I will be starting on bread and water for a full week. See how good I talk after that. I just wanted to let you know that I have been thoroughly shamed, okay? So good job. I can only hope to be slightly less of a horrible piece of human garbage going forward. Now that said, literally every single person that's been correcting me has also been wrong. Hear me out. You see, John C. Fremont was French, or at least his father was. I think that was my initial mistake right there, trying to give the name a bit of a French flair. I just did so improperly. Turns out if you look at the man's name, you'll see that there's a little horizontal line above the letter E, leaning towards the right. That's what's known as an acute accent. And when there's an acute accent over the letter E in French, it's to indicate that the vowel should be pronounced as an A, sort of like cafe or puree. In other words, the correct pronunciation of Fremont, in French at least, if we had a damn time machine, the way that he and his father would have likely said the name, is Fremont. Not Fremont, and not Fremont like I've been saying, but Fremont.
Fremont.
Very pretentious and very French sounding. I just ain't got that much phlegm in the back of my throat. So I don't know, I guess we were all wrong? Or maybe it was just me. I'll take the L on this one. I'll acquiesce. You were right. I was wrong. You are smart. I am stupid. You are very attractive. And I am not an attractive man. That said, I am fully aware that pronunciations do change over time, and currently here in the United States, Fremont is correct. You live in Fremont County, or you went to Fremont High School. I get it. So going forward, I will use Fremont. Just not today, because what you're about to hear has already been recorded, and I'm too lazy to redo it. So thank you to everyone who pointed that out. My smart-ass comments aside, I do appreciate the corrections. And just in case you're a new listener, trust me, when it comes to butchering words, I have not even yet begun to defile myself. All right, with that out of the way, let's get back to the story. And don't forget to stay put at the very end. I do have a special announcement regarding the Wild West Extravaganza. Okay, now let's get back to the story. Yeehaw! On May 13th, 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico, a turn of events that at that time was completely unknown to John C. Fremont. Even as he and his company of would-be conquerors came thundering south looking to start a revolution, they still had no idea that the war was already officially on. According to historian David Roberts, the essential mystery haunting Fremont's third expedition has to do with the colossal gulf between his official orders and what the explorers actually set out to do. For a century and a half, historians have tried to prove whether or not Fremont acted under covert orders known only to a handful of government officials. Was the third expedition, in effect, a secret war mission under the cover of a scientific foray? Or, as he had done so often in the past, did Fremont play the supreme opportunist, ignoring his orders so as to position himself to seize the glory he could see wafting on the wind? No written documentation has yet been found to bulwark the theory of an expedition guided by secret orders. Fremont himself never came clean on the question. If there was a covert mandate, we can be sure that the captain never shared it with any of his underlings. From start to finish, the Mountain Men and Delaware Indians who rode with Fremont believed that they were along on a surveying mission that happened to collide head-on with international politics. End quote. And yeah, collide they would. but not without first taking part in yet another massacre against the indigenous there in Northern California. And really, this was just a repeat of what occurred back in April on the Sacramento River, just on a lesser scale. The settlers north of Sutter's Fort were once again getting nervous about their Native American neighbors, and to be honest, this time they may have actually been somewhat justified in their worries. Per historian Paul Andrew Hutton, Fremont's party reached Peter Lassen's ranch in the Sacramento Valley on May 24th after skirmishing with Indians during much of the journey south. Fremont found the American settlers in an uproar over a decree from Castro threatening all non-Mexican citizens with expulsion, and by recent raids by Indians from the nearby hills. Some of these raiders were descendants of Mission Indians who had retreated to the mountains rather than work as serfs for Sutter or the Mexican ranchers. Others were Maitus, Wintus, and Llanas, who lived in the Sacramento Valley long before the Spanish first arrived. They numbered several thousand and sometimes raided the American and Mexican ranches for livestock. Fremont was reluctant to lead a campaign against them, but relented to the settlers' pleas, especially after he learned that Castro had sent messengers to incite the Indians against the American settlers. Quote, I resolved to anticipate the Indians and strike them a blow which would make them recognize that Castro was far and that I was near. He convinced himself that it would be unwise to leave a potentially hostile force to the rear. Fremont's combined army of settlers and his own men struck several rancheros along the Sacramento River, killing dozens of the natives and driving the rest into the hills. While the Indians were numerous, they were poorly armed and it was over quickly. Now, speaking of Fremont's so-called combined army, ever since he had arrived there in Northern California, he had been gauging the levels of unrest among the American settlers. Hal Fremont had even started to encourage them to revolt against Mexico, but at the same time, he said that he himself couldn't get involved until the California authorities moved forward with a clear act of war. Remember, he still didn't know that the United States had already made things official. Basically, Fremont was just stirring the pot while he himself just kind of sat back and waited for the proverbial shit to hit the fan. A group of American settlers calling themselves the Osos, Spanish for bears, headed south and took over the town of Sonoma. Whether this was on their own volition or at Fremont's urgings is unknown. What we do know is that they took the leading citizens of Sonoma prisoner, raided the armory, and declared California to be its own independent nation-state that they dubbed the Republic of California. They even had their own flag thrown together with scraps of ladies' underwear, complete with a star, a red stripe on the bottom, and the words California Republic, along with a brown bear that was drawn so badly that the Mexicans thought it was a pig. As crude as this emblem was, its memory endures to this day as the modern flag of California, only with the bear being drawn just a little more realistic. Now, this taking of Sonoma occurred on June 14th, 1846. And I know what you're thinking. Josh, what in the world was Kit Carson up to as all this was going on? And the answer is, why don't you mind your own business? That's what. Nah, I'm just joking. Truth is the Osos were taking over Sonoma, Carson remained with Fremont. It wasn't until Sonoma was under the Bear Flag that Fremont finally heard about the U.S. declaring war on Mexico, at which point he began calling himself the military commander of U.S. forces in California. He and Carson then marched south, linked up with the Osos, and from there, the small army, which was now numbering around 160 men, pushed further south all the way to San Francisco in what may have been one of the easiest military victories of all time. According to historian David Roberts, Mexican California was all but helpless to defend itself against the well-armed Americans. Already, Castro was fleeing southward with the only army that the territory could muster. The California Navy consisted of a single ship without guns. It was hardly surprising then that Fremont's battalion was able to take one small town after another without bloodshed. In the course of his triumphant march south, Fremont paused near San Francisco to name the narrow channel separating the bay from the ocean the Golden Gate. It was also there just due north of San Francisco where Kit Carson managed to capture a trio of Hispanic Californios. An older gentleman, Jose de la Reyes Berryessa, and his two nephews, the De Haro twins. And I say that Carson captured them, but to be honest, it's not really clear what truly occurred, other than all three men winded up dead. Apparently, Senor Berryessa was trying to visit his son, who was being held as a prisoner of the Americans, either in Sonoma or further north up at Sutter's Fort. Accounts vary, hell, we don't even know exactly where this encounter took place, but one version has it that Carson spied Berryessa and his nephews in a small boat crossing the San Francisco Bay. And once they hit dry land, Kit took him into custody. I guess the idea was that maybe they were carrying dispatches for the Mexican government. Much to Carson's shock, Fremont then stated that he had no use for prisoners and ordered Kit just to simply gun them down in cold blood. When he hesitated, Fremont raised his voice and said, "Mr. Carson, do your duty." And well, that's exactly what Kit and his fellow scouts did. Rifles sounded, and moments later, Berryessa and his nephews were lying dead on the ground. That said, there are some accounts that have Carson executing all three without even going through the trouble of taking them prisoner. Story goes that Ramon de Jara was killed immediately upon reaching the shore. His brother Francisco then threw himself onto the body as someone hollered out, "Kill the other son of a bitch." Rifles boomed again, and Francisco joined Ramon in the great hereafter. When the boy's uncle, Mr. Berryessa, asked why the boys were killed, he too was gunned down. Their bodies were then stripped and their belongings divvied up among the killers. Later on, Berryessa's son, Antonio, had to pay $25 just to get back his dead father's serepe. This version of events is somewhat backed up by another of Fremont's men, Jasper O'Farrell. He was there, and according to him, quote, Carson returned to where Fremont was standing in the corridor of the mission in the company of Gillespie, myself, and others, and said, "Captain, shall I take those men prisoner?" In response, Fremont waved his hand and said, "I have got no room for prisoners." They then advanced to within 50 yards of the three unfortunate and unarmed Californians, alighted from their horses, and deliberately shot them. I saw Carson some 2 years ago and spoke to him of this act, and he assured me that then and since he regretted to be compelled to shoot these men and says that he intended to make them prisoners. But Fremont was bloodthirsty enough to order otherwise, and he further remarked that it was not the only brutal act he was compelled to commit while under Fremont's command. Now, it's worth mentioning that a week prior to all of this occurring, 2 of the Bear Flaggers had came up missing. Upon investigation, it was learned that they had been caught by Mexican soldiers and tortured to death, like in a very gruesome manner. One of the reports I saw says that their tallywhackers were even cut off and stuffed in their mouths. So once again, the killing of Berryessa and the De Jara twins may have possibly been an extreme case of frontier justice, much like the sort that Carson had been dishing out ever since he first arrived out west. An eye for an eye, even if the eye you're plucking don't belong to the same person who plucked yourn. Also, I do feel like it's only fair to point out that according to yet another eyewitness, expedition member Thomas Martin, the 3 dead men were indeed found to have been carrying dispatches from the Mexican army. Is that true? I don't know. Martin is also the same guy I spoke of recently who claimed that the natives gathering on the Sacramento River had numbered between 4,000 to 5,000, so the man was obviously prone to stretching the truth. At the end of the day, any way you want to cut it, I think it's safe to say this was not Kit Carson's finest moment. Now, just a week later, on July 7th, the U.S. Navy arrived at Monterey. They managed to take the capital without firing a shot, and it weren't long before Fremont and his ragtag army joined up with them. Commodore Robert Stockton declared that California was now U.S. soil before reorganizing Fremont's men as a naval battalion of mounted riflemen, with Fremont being promoted to major, Lieutenant Gillespie as a captain, and Carson to a lieutenant. And by July 25th, they all set sail for San Diego. The plan was that from there, they'd strike out over land and take over Los Angeles, along with the rest of Southern California. As it turns out, though, Carson wasn't much of a seafarer. The 4-day excursion to San Diego was akin to torture, and Kit, along with several of his fellow mountain men, spent the entire time seasick. According to a Navy chaplain, Kit and his pards were lying around the deck in a spirit of resignation that would satisfy the non-resistant principles of a Quaker. 2 or 3 resolute old women might tumble the whole lot of them into the sea. Even Carson would later state that he would never again set foot on a seagoing vessel, so long as mules have backs, adding that he would rather ride on a grizzly bear than a boat. They'd land at San Diego on July 29th, where they were met with 0 resistance. Likewise with Los Angeles. It was there they learned that General Castro had pretty much disbanded his army, and that Governor Pico had fled the territory entirely. In other words, mission accomplished, at least as far as John C. Fremont was concerned. Biographer Hampton Sides, in his excellent book, Blood and Thunder, writes that both Stockton and Fremont were anxious to get the glorious news of the conquest to Washington, and to place their version of events in the hands of President Polk himself. Fremont suggested that they write dispatches and send them overland, placing them in the able hands of none other than Kit Carson. Not only would he get to see some new country and pay a visit to the nation's capital, but his journey would also take him through New Mexico, which meant he'd get to see his wife over in Taos. So it were in mid-September 1846 that Carson handpicked around a dozen men, all of whom were mounted splendidly on mules and set out east. 26 days and 800 miles later, Kit and his small party were already in New Mexico, where they were surprised to learn that it, too, was now American soil. Turns out a lot had occurred during Carson's absence. Back in June, Brigadier General Stephen Kearny and his Army of the West had descended upon Santa Fe. And much like in California, Kearny was successful in taking the entire territory of New Mexico without firing a solitary shot. Yet another bloodless victory. He then established a joint civil and military government, with Kit Carson's brother-in-law, Charles Ben, as the governor. This was followed by Kearny splitting up his command. Now that New Mexico was secure, he would take just 300 dragoons with him westward to conquer California. Remember, at this point, he had no idea what Fremont or Commodore Stockton had already accomplished. Kearny wouldn't learn of their conquest until Carson showed up on October 6th just outside the small village of Socorro. Kit introduced himself, described the recent events in California, and explained that he was delivering important dispatches from Fremont all the way to Washington, D.C. And, well, let's just say that Carson wasn't really all that happy with what happened next. General Kearny commandeered the dispatches and gave them to his own guide, one of Kit's old colleagues, Tom Broken Hand Fitzpatrick. As capable as Fitzpatrick was, he had recently let it slip that he was unfamiliar with the country west of Socorro. So rather than continue on as a guide, Fitzpatrick would see to it that these dispatches reached the capital, and Kit, per General Kearny's orders, would replace Fitzpatrick as his guide. Historian David Roberts describes Carson's reaction as follows. Kit heard these words with great dismay. It had been almost 2 years since he had seen his beloved Josefa. On the way to Washington, he planned to spend one night at his Taos home. And now that he was 9/10 of the way there, to turn around and head west once more seemed a cruel fate. In addition, Carson had a resolute sense of duty about performing Stockton and Fremont's errand. Although Kearny had overruled those officers, Carson was so reluctant to abandon his mission that he planned to sneak away in the night until a comrade talked him out of it. And by the way, Kearny would also send back all but 100 of his dragoons. I guess he figured that since California was already conquered, he wouldn't need so many men. A decision that would ultimately turn out to bite him in the ass, literally. Unbeknownst to Kearny, things over in California weren't quite as peaceful as they had been when Carson left. To quote Hampton Sides, the territory had been convulsed by insurrection. The Americans had been kicked out of Los Angeles, out of Santa Barbara, and out of every other coastal settlement south of Monterey. The Mexicans, outraged by harsh terms clamped on them by Commodore Robert Stockton, including curfews and arbitrary arrests without a hearing, had risen up and attacked American positions. In the words of one historian, the revolt had blossomed like a crown fire leaping through mountain timber. A manifesto had been circulated among the citizens that read, "We, all the inhabitants of the Department of California, as members of the great Mexican nation, declare that it is and has been our wish to belong to her alone. Therefore, the intrusive authorities appointed by the invading forces of the United States are null and void. All North Americans being foes of Mexico, we swear not to lay down our arms until we see them ejected from Mexican soil." End quote. So in other words, by the time Carson delivered Kearny and his dragoons safely to California in early December, the rebels had the upper hand, and Kearny, with a force of just over 100 worn-out men, was headed straight for a trap. Nonetheless, the general had his men set up camp at a place known as Warner's Ranch, just due south of present-day Warner Springs. Seeing as how Commodore Stockton was still in San Diego, basically under siege, Kearny had to send a message to him requesting reinforcements. And these reinforcements arrived on December 5th, all 39 of them, a mix of Marines and sailors under the leadership of Captain Archibald Gillespie. Gillespie also brought news that around 100 or so California insurgents were camped not too far away in the San Pasqual Valley, being led by the former governor's brother, Captain Andres Pico. And despite Kearny's dragoons and animals being plumb tuckered out after a long journey across the desert, the general chose to attack. Pico and his men were smack dab in between the dragoons and Stockton anyway, so rather than go around, I guess Kearny figured he'd go straight through them. Hell, even Kit Carson thought it was a good idea. After all this time on the West Coast, he really didn't have all that high of an opinion regarding the fighting abilities of your average Californio. He'd go so far as to say that all you had to do was yell, make a rush, and they'd just run away. As it turns out, it wouldn't be quite so easy there in the San Pasqual Valley. Later on that night, Kearny sent out a small patrol to do a little recon. The original plan was just to gather some intel, and if things looked promising, they would attack at dawn. This changed, however, when the scouts returned at midnight with news that they'd been spotted. With the element of surprise lost, Kearny immediately mobilized the dragoons, thinking that at very least they could use the darkness to their advantage. Within 15 minutes, the soldiers set out at a trot, with our very own Kit Carson right there amongst them. And unfortunately for all concerned, things soon devolved into pure chaos. Kearny's lead element, under the command of a Captain Johnson, erroneously thought that Kearny ordered a charge. So he and his men rushed forward, leaving the bulk of the dragoons behind. Sure enough, almost immediately upon reaching the enemy camp, Johnson was shot dead. Even Carson nearly cashed in his chips as he was thrown from his horse, causing him to make a mad crawl for safety as the dragoons came thundering from behind. Quote, "I came very near to being trodden to death and finally saved myself from crawling under them." This was followed by the Californios mounting a counterattack of their own with lancers, horse soldiers wielding deadly 9-foot-long iron-tipped spears like something out of a damn medieval nightmare. To make matters worse, many of the dragoon rifles were rendered useless due to the rain and fog from the night before. That being the case, the Americans were just reduced to fighting with sabers, or those without swords just swinging their rifles like clubs. And then, if all of that isn't bad enough, the dragoons fell for the oldest trick in the book. The Californios pretended to retreat, and the Americans followed, straight into an ambush. Captain Moore, the officer who had replaced the dead Captain Johnson, got ran through with a lance. So did Captain Gillespie, and even General Kearny fell prey to the lancers, taking a spear tip to his hindquarters. Hell, truth be told, damn near all of the dragoons involved in this fight ended up getting wounded to various degrees. Meanwhile, the famous Kit Carson had gotten his hands on a rifle that actually worked and took refuge from behind a boulder, Mountain Man style, just trying to pick off the lancers one by one. Even still, this battle was looking more like something out of Game of Thrones than a fight between civilized armies. Only thing that stopped it from being a complete slaughter was the Americans managed to get one of their howitzers into play. As soon as they began firing it off, the Californios wisely hauled ass in the opposite direction. Maybe. From what I understand, this is somewhat contested. General Kearny would later write in his own official report that none of their field pieces saw action, and the only mention of this howitzer being fired comes from Captain Gillespie. Another theory as to why the Californios retreated is due to the rest of the dragoons finally catching up. During the thick of things, at the same time that Kearny and Gillespie were getting lanced, there were only about 45 soldiers taking part in the fight. The rest had been left in the rear thanks to Captain Johnson's premature charge and just the general chaos of the battle. And out of those 45, 36 were casualties, with at least 18 dead and just as many injured. Either way, the fight was over in less than half an hour. And thanks to Kearny still holding the field, despite being unconscious, the Battle of San Pasqual is technically considered to have been a U.S. victory, even though they didn't manage to kill a single one of the Californio Lancers. At least that's according to their leader, Andres Pico. It does look like some historians think Pico may have lost as many as 2 men, but either way you want to shake it, the Americans got their asses handed to them. Now, there was a lot more drama involved. I don't want to get too far off in the weeds, as this battle could easily turn into its own series, but long story short, either that night or the following night, Kearny ended up sending Carson, along with 2 other men, to sneak through enemy lines and fetch more reinforcements from Commodore Stockton. It was Carson, Navy Lieutenant Edward Bill, and a Native American scout whose name has unfortunately been lost to history. All 3 removed their shoes and secured them onto their belts before they started crawling. And they kept a-crawling for at least 2 miles on their bellies, at times getting to within mere feet of the insurgent sentries. And once they made it past them, they continued the rest of the journey by foot, but not before losing their daggum shoes. Carson would later recall, "We finally got through but had the misfortune to have lost our shoes, and had to travel over country covered with prickly pears and rocks." Now that was Carson's typical way of downplaying his own actions. This midnight run proved so treacherous that Lieutenant Bill, according to Carson, became deranged from fatigue, and it would take another 2 years for him to fully recover. Even Carson couldn't walk for several days, and there are accounts stating that the unnamed native, although able to make it to San Diego, soon died from his exertions. So yeah, this crawl for reinforcements was no small thing, and this would only serve to further Carson's reputation as a legendary frontiersman. Like I said earlier, there's a lot more involved. I'm sort of glossing over some of the gritty details, including the slaughter of mules for food. But one of the most detailed accounts that I was able to find on the Battle of San Pasqual comes from an old article published by the San Diego Reader, written by Glenn Wallace. I'll leave the link down below if you'd like to give it a read. I'm telling you, this really was a fascinating little skirmish. Long story short, once those reinforcements arrived, General Kearny was able to limp his remaining dragoons the rest of the way into San Diego. And brother, he was pissed. Ended up blaming both Stockton and Fremont for his troubles. Matter of fact, for slightly unrelated reasons, Kearny would even eventually place Fremont under arrest and have him court-martialed. But that's another story that's gonna have to wait for another day. Speaking of Fremont, I'll be completely honest here, I don't really know exactly where he was during the Battle of San Pasqual. But he wasn't in San Diego, and he damn sure wasn't with Kearny. He would, however, join Kearny just a month later as they retook Los Angeles. Santa Barbara was next, and by January 13th, old Andres Pico finally surrendered. At long last, the war there in California was officially over. As for Carson, he would join Kearny on the march to Los Angeles, and it's there where he linked back up with Fremont. In his book, A Newer World, David Roberts wrote that in subsequent years, Carson and Fremont would share many an evening together by the fireplace, hashing over the exploits of the three expeditions. And Carson would nurse his former commander to health in 1849, after the most extreme ordeal of Fremont's life. But never again after that day of triumph in Los Angeles would the two men ever ride together. And that about sums up Carson's involvement with the Mexican-American War, but not his time spent with the Army. In the years to come, Carson would attain the rank of Brevet Brigadier General. Not bad for an illiterate runaway from Boone's Lick. Now, we'll get to all of that eventually. We've got a lot more ground to cover on old Kit Carson. But for now, it's still early 1847, and while Kit was stuck in California, a tragic disaster was playing out at his home base in Taos. On January 19th, a combined force of disaffected Hispanics and Pueblos revolted against the American occupation in northern New Mexico. Before it was all said and done, at least 150 people would be killed right there in Taos, including Kit's brother-in-law, Charles Bent, and several members of his wife Josefa's family. Josefa narrowly escaped death herself by digging through an adobe wall and disguising herself as a Native American. Of course, Carson wouldn't hear about this until months later, in April, when he finally made his way back to Taos. It had been nearly 2 years since he'd seen his wife, and after a layover of just 10 days, Carson was on the move yet again. Remember that transcontinental trip to Washington, D.C. that Kearny denied him way back in the fall of 1846? Well, by early 1847, Carson got his chance. After the Californios relinquished control of Los Angeles, Fremont once again gave Kit a bundle of letters and dispatches that he wanted delivered to D.C. ASAP as possible. And once again, Carson headed overland with a small party of men. They had a close call in the desert with the Apache, but were able to repel the attack and continue their journey. After that brief layover in Taos that I just mentioned, their next stop was St. Louis, and it's there where Carson was reunited with his daughter, Adeline. First time seeing each other in years. Thankfully, she had been well cared for by Kit's relatives. From St. Louis, Carson would catch a riverboat and then a train, and finally, by the end of May 1847, he arrived at the nation's capital. Kit wasted no time in delivering the dispatches and would have immediately headed back west had he not been delayed by then-President James K. Polk. And, well, famous mountain man or not, I guess when the president calls, you answer. The only problem was it would be a few weeks before Polk could pencil him in. As such, Carson was pretty much just stuck there in the swamp and had to be subjected to DC's finest trying to wine and dine him. As I'm sure you can imagine, the former fur trapper didn't exactly fit in with polite society. First of all, his physical appearance was a shock to many. I guess from all those dime novels, folks started thinking that Carson was a 7-foot-tall giant who shot fireballs from his eyes and bolts of lightning from his arse. A young army officer would recall his astonishment at first meeting Kit, saying, quote, "I cannot express my surprise at beholding a stoop-shouldered man with reddish hair, freckled face, soft blue eyes, and nothing to indicate extraordinary courage or daring. He spoke but little and answered questions in monosyllables." Years later, another acquaintance would recall that the Kit Carson of my imagination was over 6 feet high, a sort of modern Hercules in his build, with an enormous beard and a voice like a roused lion. The real Kit Carson I found to be a plain, simple, unostentatious man, rather below medium height, little or no beard, and a voice as soft and gentle as a woman's. And then, of course, there was the fact that Carson just felt inadequate among city dwellers. You know, he had almost zero education, he couldn't read, and I guess he felt like his past, especially the fact that he had once had a Native American wife, would cause a scandal or somehow bring some type of shame upon Fremont or Fremont's father-in-law, Senator Benton. Turns out this would not be the case. No such scandal materialized. But that said, Carson still never really warmed up to high society. He didn't care for the politicians. Certainly can't blame him there. He didn't appreciate the way people treated him like some sort of exotic curiosity. And he found it next to impossible to sleep inside on a bed, instead opting to catch his Z's outside on an open-air patio. Thankfully, John C. Fremont's wife, Jessie, took Kit under her wings, and the two ended up getting along fairly well. Jessie would even entertain Carson by reading aloud various works of great literature. According to her, he considered Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake, to be the finest expression of outdoor life that he had ever heard. At last, on the morning of June 14, 1847, Carson was ushered into the president's office. Polk quizzed him on his various exploits and officially commissioned Kit as a second lieutenant, a promotion that not only came with a fancy new uniform, but a raise. What's more, the president had his own dispatches that he wanted Carson to deliver back to California. But first, he wanted to honor Kit with a dinner at the White House. Once again, I don't think this is going to come as a surprise, but this made the famous guide extremely nervous. You gotta think, a guy like Carson was much more at home in a teepee or an adobe than he was in a mansion surrounded by Gentiles. That said, First Lady Sarah Polk found Kit's table manners to be faultless, even if he was a little on the shy side. When she tried asking him about his now famous late-night crawl through enemy lines, Carson just got red in the face and refused to speak of his own adventures. Much to Kit's relief, he was soon on a train headed out of town, dispatches for General Kearny in tow. And no sooner had he arrived in California than he was sent straight back to D.C. with even more dispatches. All total, Kit would make this trip 3 times. It was on his third visit east in 1848 when he allegedly delivered news of the California gold strike, which of course helped to usher in the gold rush of 1849. Now, these cross-country adventures were not without danger. Thanks to one of the soldiers who accompanied Carson on his second journey, we get a little insight into both Kit's survival skills when in hostile territory and his apparent softening when it came to dealing with Native Americans. Lieutenant George Brewerton would describe Carson and his camp habits as follows. A braver man than Kit perhaps never lived. In fact, I doubt if he ever knew what fear was. But with all of this, he exercised great caution. When arranging his bed, his saddle, which was also used as a pillow, was disposed in such a manner as to form a barricade for his head. His pistols, half-cocked, were laid above it, and his trusty rifle reposed beneath his blanket by his side, where it was not only ready for instant use but perfectly protected from the damp. Except now and then to light his pipe, you never caught Kit exposing himself to the full glare of the campfire. Kit would say, hang around the fire if you will, it may do for you if you like it, but I don't want to have an Indian slip an arrow into me when I can't see him, end quote. Brewerton also told of an encounter they had with the Paiute tribe when traveling through Utah. In past times, when any sort of threat or even a perceived threat presented itself, Carson and his companions would simply attack, kill as many natives as they possibly could, and just hope like hell they got the message not to mess with the palefaces. This is how Kit treated the Apache, it's how he treated the Blackfeet, and it's how he treated the Klamath. By the late 1840s, however, it looks as if Carson had begun to take a somewhat gentler approach. Rather than attack the Paiute, he simply took one of their young men hostage, explaining to him in his own tongue that he wouldn't be harmed so long as his people didn't attack their camp. Sure enough, once they had made their way through Paiute country intact, Carson released the hostage and gave him a pair of pants for his troubles. Per Lieutenant Brewerton, the young man was extremely pleased and began to strut about like a city dandy in his new breeches. Now, while I have no doubt that Carson enjoyed these trips, he still had a young wife at home that he barely even knew. They'd been married damn near 6 years, during which time they had only spent a few months together at most. And according to stories passed down by the family, Josefa was beginning to resent Kit for his prolonged absence. And truth be told, Carson himself was growing tired. Since the beginning of the Mexican-American War, he had traveled nearly 16,000 miles, mostly on the back of a mule. And at nearly 40 years of age, he weren't getting no younger. So it were, after that final trip to D.C., Carson returned to his wife in Taos and finally started making moves to settle down for good. He'd once again go into partnership with a former mountain man, this time Lucian Maxwell, and try his hand at ranching. Quote, "We had been leading a roving life long enough, and now was the time, if ever, to make a home for ourselves and children." We were getting old. End quote. But that wildlife wasn't through with Kit Carson just yet. He'd soon be called into service again, and again, and again. Whether it be to help rescue captives held by the Apache or to once more go to war on behalf of his country. When duty called, Carson answered, and the adventures were far from over. And with that, I hope you'll join me here next week as we continue on with the life and times of Kit Carson. By the way, if you're wondering what any of these people look like that I'm talking about, I did recently send out a new edition of the Wild West Extravaganza newsletter featuring photos of many of them. Carson's wife Josefa, John C. Fremont, Fremont's wife Jessie, Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie, and several others. If you'd like to put a face to some of these names, just head on over to wildwestextra.com and hit that tab up top that says newsletter. Or just click that link down below in this episode's description. The newsletter is 100% free, by the way. You don't even have to sign up for it if you don't want to. Now, earlier I said I had a special announcement. I'd like to address it now before we go. Something I've been noticing that seems to be on the uptick lately is the amount of people, I can only assume new listeners, asking if the show has been recorded using AI or artificial intelligence. And the answer is no. Trust me, I mispronounce way too much shit to be using AI. If that was the case, then somebody owes me a damn refund. And in all seriousness, I despise AI. I truly hate it. But sadly, I think it's only going to get worse. Right now, as of today, it's relatively easy to spot, even with just audio. There's at least one piece of software out there, whose name I'm not going to mention, that is scary good when it comes to AI voices. And a lot of people on YouTube have started using it. But still, if you listen close enough, you can tell it's fake. Even when people try to clone their own voices, you can tell. That's not going to be the case in another couple of years. Whether it's audio, video, or just AI-generated photos, the technology's soon going to get to a level where it'll be impossible to detect. Right now, it's just a nuisance. Low-effort content just flooding the internet as people try to make a quick buck. But in the future, we are screwed. Or at least we are, unless there are some serious restrictions put into place. You know, we're already living in a day and age where people don't know who to trust, especially when it comes to the news. Everyone's in their own little reality bubbles, and I do think that's where a lot of the divisiveness is coming from. And once AI gets to the point that we can't even trust our own eyes and ears, that's going to be a serious problem. Like, what the hell, people? Am I the only person that remembers Terminator 2? There's no way this ends well. Anyway, I do not know how to fix it, but I can promise you that as long as I'm still able to talk, the Wild West Extravaganza will be recorded by me, Josh, and not some soulless robot. Now, just in case you're interested, I will give you a glimpse behind the curtain real quick. I record this show on an RE320 microphone. I use a PodTrack P4 as my interface, and I record directly onto a digital audio workstation called Audacity, or sometimes there's another one called Hindenburg, but you get the picture. Once I'm done recording, it's time to edit. I now have an editor who I send my audio files to, shout out to Christina, and when she's done, the file gets sent right back to me. All she's doing is cutting out all of my verbal flubs, the dead air, the numerous times I have to re-record phrases and sentences, random coughs, and even fits of rage, all that sort of stuff. At which point, I'll then do a final edit. Just make sure the pacing is where I want it to be, and then as my final step, I add a few audio effects. One of these effects is known as a de-esser, which is just meant to help lessen the harshness of all my S sounds. There's a lot of stuff we don't hear with our naked ears that the microphone picks up, sort of like mouth clicks. That's another effect I add, a de-mouth clicker. You wouldn't be able to hear it if we were talking face to face, but with my mouth right up against the microphone, sometimes it makes these little clicking noise so it sounds like I'm talking over a damn campfire. I'll then apply a compressor. This sort of just smooths out the audio, makes the lows a little higher and the highs a little lower. That way it's not too jarring if my voice goes from quiet to loud. I'll then add a little EQ, mostly with the goal of removing some of the bassiness or muddiness. Apparently, I have a deep voice, and the way it sounds in my head compared to how it sounds when I'm listening back with headphones is definitely not the same. So rather than sounding like Darth Vader, I adjust the EQ. Sort of like you do with your car stereo. You know, you can raise and lower the bass or treble. I essentially do the same thing. All with the chief aim of making myself sound as natural as possible. When you listen to the Wild West Extravaganza, I want it to be as if I'm right there talking to you in person. I am not always successful. There is a very fine line between sounding natural and the audio files sounding stepped on or sometimes even robotic. This has, without a doubt, been the hardest part of this show, hands down. Matter of fact, I've even been on the verge of quitting numerous times just due to not being able to get my audio where I want it to be quality-wise. I feel like my research and my writing and my delivery, it's all on point, but if the audio isn't up to par, then it just seems like a wasted effort. Anyway, that's my long, drawn-out way of saying, no, I do not use AI, other than on rare occasions like today where I jokingly use the
Fremont
voice. And I assume, or at least I hope, that it's very obvious that what I'm doing in cases like that is somewhat tongue-in-cheek. All the other effects I just mentioned, the EQ and the compressor and the plugins, all of that is very industry standard. There is not a podcast out there, at least one worth listening to, that does not have some sort of EQ or compressor applied to it. And all of this is done simply to make the listener experience much better. Trust me, if you listen to the raw audio of what I record, it would be unbearable. And these effects aren't even what people mean when they ask if I'm recording with AI anyway. What they mean is if it's some sort of a text-to-speech program where you just feed it words and some fake-ass robot voice talks them back to you. No, hell no, I do not use AI. All right, thanks for bearing with me. Till next week, try not to declare yourself to be a military commander over another nation's territory unless you're sure you've got them whipped already. And don't bring no wet gunpowder to a lance fight. And please, for the love of God, don't take anyone hostage and then expect that just giving them a pair of your raggedy-ass blue jeans will make everything okay. All right? Adios.